when Clavell was mayor, the term for mayor went from 2 to 3 years. And also, and very significantly, the city charter was changed, giving the mayor the power to hire and fire the department heads, which Bernie never had.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's a very big change.
That's in part why he created
CETO in the first place, right? So Clavell was able to perfect some of the reforms that Bernie was being frustrated in trying to do. And I was coming from a different perspective. Part of the reason why I'm sort of off in my own orbit is because both as a journalist but also politically, my perspective is different than some of these people who work inside the system, is that I'm more of a decentralist. I was pushing for the establishment of neighborhood assemblies, which did get established, but I was also pushing for the a reform of the commission system, and I headed a panel on behalf of Bernie and Clavell and all those guys. But my position was more to elect commissioners for the key commissions, that I felt that if you really want to have community involvement in decisions relating to the police and planning and the important departments, you need to elect those people rather than appoint them. It's arguable. You could elect them on a proportional basis. Every ward gets a person who's a police commissioner. Then you have a police commissioner who is your police commissioner, right? Right now, it's much more centralized. We have a unified administration. The mayor is stronger than he has ever been. But now he's a Democrat, and he wants to do all the things that Bernie wanted to stop. And the progressives have provided him with the tools to do it.
By making it stronger than ever. Well, that's the whole argument about the filibuster and all sorts of things. I'm a former Congress reporter, so it's very
So you see, but again, Bernie had a critique of the system. He struggled against structural impediments. He showed how you could run a more streamlined, efficient administration, brought in a new generation of people, right, who then continued the reforms and made structural changes that have long-term implications. The only thing they couldn't do is they can't change capitalism. Capitalism is capitalism. The market is the market. And so on certain things, they haven't been able, like rent prices, the price of housing, the price of everything. It's difficult to control the market. That was a fight that we lost. The fight for rent stabilization in Burlington was a fight we lost very early on. And because Bernie is a pragmatist, if you know you're not going to win a fight, better not to get in the fight. And so he avoids issues on which he would obviously lose.
Interesting.
And as mayor, he often did that. He was selective about he wants to have something where he's assured of an outcome because he's trying to build a record and a legacy, as a politician and an administrator would want to do.
So for people who are wary of him, they look at his big promises, his overhaul of the government, what would you say as someone who has seen him in government?
Well, I think you should take him at his word in the sense that his aspirations are true, they are sincere, as opposed to Trump, where you cannot believe anything that he says, that he really means it. Bernie means what he says, but how he would go about doing it would be in a very practical, incremental way, and he would put an emphasis on participation, and the thing to be wary about is not to allow the process to be controlled by experts.
Because you think when he does that...
Because that would, to keep the doors open, that would be the struggle. The struggle would be to keep Bernie accountable after the election, so that what he had built as a movement was sustained. The mistake that Barack Obama made, on purpose or by accident, was by demobilizing his own base after he became president. One would hope that Bernie is more of an organizer and would keep his base mobilized and would keep in touch with it.
But you're saying the struggle to keep him accountable would be the base needing to keep him accountable because he could maybe fall into the...
That's right. That'd be
more establishment.
Not establishment, but expertise. I think he has his own view of things. His values are his values, but the devil's in the details, and how you implement those things, might be different, and that he might accept an expedient solution where a more deliberative approach that took longer might result in a better outcome.
And by better, more progressive?
Possibly, sure. Not everything he did was progressive. He's, again, pragmatic about that. Not every tax reform that he proposed was progressive. The gross receipts tax, which was implemented in Burlington, is not a progressive tax. So, he's not a purist in that sense either. He's a pragmatist. He would prefer the more progressive outcome, but he wants an outcome.
So what were the three biggest, if I was going to focus on three big moments in his time as mayor, what would they be?
Well, the waterfront fight is definitely, there's a lot going on there. It's an evolution. It involves a lot of different players and people who are important in Burlington throughout this period. So I'd say that's one of the key things. As mayor. Well, I mentioned the peace movement thing. I think that's number...
Peace movement, GE.
Yeah, the GE. His relationships with social movements as exemplified by that. It's not the only example. And I think the other thing is to look at the administrative style that I described earlier, which was to work inside and outside the system to basically try to establish extra parliamentary groups that can then place pressure on the system that it exists, and to keep people mobilized. That he was able to do that, particularly in the early years. A lot of new initiatives, a lot of groups making demands, but he was keeping in touch with them, and he was able to manage and mobilize those energies to, and that also an expansive, and related to this is a more expansive view of the role of the city than previous mayors had. And this is kind of significant, I think, because it could be applied at the national level as well, is that, the conservative idea of a mayor is, keep the bottom line, keep everybody happy, just, be a manager. Bernie's idea was to be a manager, but also to be a voice and a spokesman, and to extend the scope of concern of city government. So writing letters to the federal government about U.S. policy, doing things like happened in City Hall last night, never would have happened before Bernie. Now,
Really?
Oh no, of course. Before Bernie, you went to City Hall, there was no public forum, by the way. There was no, that idea that there was a time when the public could speak.
That start with him?
That starts with him. That's a very small initiative, but significant. A dedicated time every time the city council meets for the public to say whatever they want for 2 or 3 minutes, and these guys got to listen. That's a small but significant initiative. In the old days, well, where are you from? When did you move here? It's first question. And as soon as you answer that question, they know how to receive you or not receive you. After Bernie, that changed. So, though that kind of expanding the both the openness but also the role of government, so sister city programs and different kinds of initiatives, and also expanding the challenging the state's control of the city. In Vermont is a kind of a top-down state in some sense, in the sense that in order for charter change to take place in Burlington, it also has to be approved by the state legislature.
Interesting.
They have to, so they could block things that he wanted to do, and he was trying to expand the taxing power of the city. He was also trying to expand the realm of concern of the city, that we can be concerned about nuclear power or nuclear weapons or foreign policy in general or human rights. These are all things, are legitimate topics that can be discussed in a city, and we can have an opinion about them, and we can also send our advice to our congressmen. Now, very many cities don't agree with this. This is a more expansive view of what cities should do. And be concerned with. And there's a tendency to retreat from that when you don't have a person who is leading the charge, to retreat into a more provincial attitude. And Bernie was, someone who broke through that and opened the city up in that way. And I think that's a significant change that has to some extent sustained over time, and you saw a small example of it.
That's really interesting. Okay. Anything else I should know?
I think you
I've got
get
a
the
lot
picture.
to work with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so it seems like the F-35 thing might be another story, because it is something that is people are beating the drum on that here, right?
Have been for a long time, 8 or 9 years now.
Wow.
Well, you saw the Digger article, but that's kind of more on Bernie's. He's sometimes a hawk, sometimes a dove. But yes, the F-35 it's been growing. I would say now it's emerging as somewhat of a state issue. Whether it'll play in the next election cycle statewide is hard to say at this point. I think it's somewhat analogous to Vermont Yankee, which was a nuclear power plant in the southeastern part of Vermont for 40 years, now closed, opened in 1972. And, at first the anti-nuclear movement was small and there were very few protests and there were just a few of us. Then, starting in the late 70s, it became more of an issue for the environmental movement. In the 80s, it became an economic issue. By the time that the new millennium started and 2010, 2012 comes along, the legislature is voting to close Vermont Yankee. And ultimately, the company that owned it did close it, not because they were fighting in court, but they said it's no longer economically viable. So it took many years, and it took decades before the issue became more than a local concern, a local health or environmental concern, to become a concern for the legislature and the state. Right now, there's legislation pending. It's not binding legislation, but it is legislation pending in the state legislature on the F-35. You should look into that.
Yeah.
It's in the midst. It's been approved by, I think, the House, and now it's going up to the Senate in the next. It's a biennial session, so they can deal with it next January, February. So as the 2020 elections are just opening, they will be resolving this question, which again doesn't say you can't bring the planes, but it's a big statement for the legislature of the state, and it's a kind of a precursor. It's part of that acknowledging as a state issue, as a state problem, as something that we need to have oversight of, and something on which we challenge the prerogatives of the federal government.
Right, and that's
interesting.